Bom, gente, vamos agora para a nossa última speaker. Eu tenho um baita orgulho de a gente ter conseguido trazer ela aqui para o nosso festival. Ela é pioneira nesse design organizacional adaptativo. Ela fala muito dos futuros do trabalho, que não é futuro, né? É o presente, ou não é também. Eu gosto muito da visão de mundo dela. Tem 20 anos de experiência em transformação de ambientes complexos, AirBnb, GE, Johnson Johnson. E ela tem o sonho e o foco em eliminar a burocracia, impulsionar talento, modernizar práticas em ambientes de trabalhos tradicionais. Ela já foi, Chief Innovation Officer do grupo McChrystal, e hoje ela é partner da The Ready. Vocês sabem o quanto a The Ready e o olhar da The Ready influenciam a maneira como eu vejo e penso cultura de aprendizagem. Ela, além de tudo, ela é co-host de um podcast bárbaro chamado Brave New Work também, com vocês, a Rodney Evans. Hi there, how are you?
Hello, everyone. How are you?
We're fine, thank you. Where are you talking from?
I'm in Washington, D.C. today, working with a group from the Ready. So not at home, but in a beautiful surrounding, and the cherry blossoms are in season. It's going to be a great weekend.
So, this is the last thing you're going to do before the weekend, no?
I sure hope so.
Very good. So, let's start this. The stage is yours. Thank you a lot.
Amazing. Okay, so hi, everyone. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you about Brave New Work. At the Ready, we concern ourselves with changing the way that the world works. And we believe that the way that we are meant to do that is by reinventing organizations. We know that the systems that we work in, that govern us, that educate us, have some work to do in terms of their ability to serve us. And so at the Ready, we are working to rethink the way that work works. Oh, let's see. Sorry, y'all. We are not advancing here. There we go. So this is an organizational chart. This will be very familiar to a lot of you. And what's funny is that this hasn't changed much. And so usually when I'm live with the group, I ask them, when do you think this org chart might be from? And I get guesses from the 1800s to yesterday to I think that's my company's org chart. And the answer is actually 1910. Now, why do I show you an org chart? Because if I showed you anything else that was 120 years old, you would immediately say, that's a century old. If I showed you a house or a piece of technology or anything else, you would be able to date it and say, that's something that's antiquated. For the most part, our ways of working have really evolved in the last 100 years. But in terms of how we organize ourselves, they haven't. And I can't tell you how many times I start working with a new company or a new client, and I tell them I do org design work, and what they immediately think is we move boxes around on a piece of paper because that's how work gets done. But most of us that work in systems understand that's not how work gets done at all. So the question is, why haven't we changed much in 100 years? This is another funny pop quiz that I give to companies to sort of help them notice aspects of their ways of working that might be old or stuck. So these are some ways of working that we've collected. Insist on doing everything through channels. Don't permit shortcuts to be taken. Refer matters to committees for further study. Try to make those committees big, at least 5 people. Haggle over the wording of communication, really wordsmith it. Refer back to matters we already decided on. It's my least favorite. And multiply procedures and clearances. Get more approvals, get more eyes on things. Just add layers of complication. And I always ask, where do you think I might have gotten these ways of working? And again, what I hear from companies around the world is, that sounds a lot like us. I recognize us in what you're saying. We do some of these things. And actually where they came from was the CIA's manual to sabotage from World War II. Now, it's a funny story to tell at cocktail parties, but what concerns us is why has our way of working become synonymous with what it takes to sabotage a company? And the evidence of this is everywhere. I'm sure the audience here knows these stats as well or better than I do. 50% of people are unhappy in their jobs. 50% of people are not engaged in their work. Almost half frequently think about quitting. And about 15% are actively disengaged. These are the saboteurs who are there actively trying to make work worse for the rest of us. You add on to this the Great Resignation, a huge amount of dissatisfaction, people leaving the workforce in droves. And what we have is a real problem on our hands. And besides just the human component of this, what we know is that companies aren't able to survive. What we're seeing is large organizations are not adapting to globalization, to complexity, to the speed at which work is getting done, to emergent events like pandemics. And so the lifespan of a company has diminished radically over the last 100 years or so. And that's curious to us. Why are companies not resilient? Why are they not able to make it? And it's not just survival. It's also that companies are not able to get the same return on assets that they once did. Again, if we look over the last 60 years or so, ROA has gone from hovering around 5% to hovering under 2%. And to us, that's a story about efficiency. That's a story that says we have gotten as much juice for the squeeze as we can in a lot of ways. We've been so focused on getting more with less over the last 50 years that we are no longer able to get the return on the material we have. We are bogged down under the weight of our own systems. So our employees aren't happy, our companies aren't surviving and thriving, and we're not making the money that we used to. What is happening here? Why are our systems crumbling around us? The concept I want to talk to you today about is organizational debt. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about what we mean by that and how it shows up. But I'm going to start here because I'm imagining that when you look across this, you probably see some things that feel familiar to you. There are ways of working that we have to live with every day. In some cases, positive, in some cases, not so positive, but this is the debt we pay to work in our organizations. Sometimes that looks like a lot of time spent in meetings where decisions don't get made, nothing really valuable happens. Sometimes that looks like the policies or roles or processes that we don't need in order to do our work, but still are hanging around and can still sort of catch us up. Sometimes that looks like working in silos. We hear this a lot in big companies. It's just, the debt of having to work around that organizational chart that I showed you, rather than being able to go where I need to go to get what I need to get my work done, is in itself a form of organizational debt. And this debt is all around us. And what is interesting to us is how it's so unseen, but in other venues, in other domains, we're very clear on what debt looks like. So when we have financial debt, we know the cost of that, what it pays to service a financial debt. We hear a lot in technology about technical debt, about the software and hardware that we have to keep maintaining, even though we don't use it anymore. But we don't look at this organizational debt in the same way. And we should, because it's expensive. So I'm going to give you a really easy example, but I bet based on that slide where I showed you a whole bunch of stuff, there were probably already some that are coming to mind for you. So this is a real example that I took from a client several years ago, but I'm willing to bet that you can think of examples that are familiar. And when we get to the Q&A, I would love to talk a little bit more about what you're seeing and sensing in your own organizations that might be a flavor of organizational debt. So imagine that we're in a bank, just a retail bank, and somebody makes a mistake. They make a mistake on a form, and that mistake on the form costs $10,000 to the bank. What happens? We probably institute some kind of overview, some kind of 4i process, so that the manager now has to look at every single form. So one $10,000 mistake multiplied over 10 forms a day, multiplied over 10 tellers in that bank, costs us $1 million a year. To save a $10,000 mistake that we might never have made again. That's organizational debt. It's where we put a complicated solution into a complex system and expect that it's going to solve a problem that may be novel. And then we pay that debt service. We pay that manager in time and money and probably frustration to check all of those forms forever. The cost of this, roughly in the US alone, is estimated to be about $3.5 trillion per year, according to Gary Hamel and Michele Zanini, who wrote the book Humanocracy. That is such a phenomenal amount of money. And yet, when we go into companies and they're looking to save money or they're looking to become more efficient, this isn't where they want to look. They want to look at reducing headcount or increasing margin or changing their pricing strategy. But the money and the efficiency and the resilience is actually in clearing out this organizational debt that's like the sludge in our system that we're all having to wade through all the time. We feel very strongly that it is time for a significant change here. And at the Ready, we believe in self-management. I'm happy to talk with you all more about what that looks like. But fundamentally, what we're trying to design is a different kind of operating system. What we mean by operating system is just like the operating system on your phone, it is what is underneath what we experience as our organizational culture. So when people say to me, oh, you work on culture, I disagree with that. I believe that culture is an emergent property from all of the choices that we make in our operating system. The policies, the practices, that Monday meeting that doesn't work for us, that bank manager checking all of those forms, those are practices in our operating system. And what they result in is the culture that we live and breathe every day of our lives. We believe that the old operating system, the one that admires those line and block charts, the one that is rife with those ways of working that look a lot like sabotage, has outlived its utility. And it's really time for something new. So what kind of operating system are we designing for? Well, this is an easy shortcut that we tend to use. On one side of your screen, you can see a lighted intersection, just a standard traffic light. And on the other side, you can see a roundabout. I know we have folks here from all over the world today. In the US, we have about 100 times as many traffic lights as we have roundabouts. People in the US don't know how to drive in roundabouts, and they're very freaked out by them. And so their assumption is that traffic lights are better because it's what we're familiar with and it's what we're comfortable with. But actually, the problem with traffic lights is that they assume that drivers are not to be trusted. They assume that people need to be commanded and controlled and told when to stop and go. A traffic light doesn't care if there's no car coming for 50 miles. You have to sit at that red light. And that's what a traditional operating system feels like. It's an unseen force or management or top-down hierarchy that assumes that people can't use good judgment. A roundabout assumes that people can figure it out, that we need some simple rules and simple constraints, like the fact that we all go the same direction, in order to use good judgment and keep ourselves and others safe. A roundabout assumes that the people who are operating in the context should have the freedom to make the best decision they can. A traffic light does not assume that. Roundabouts have these kinds of constraints that are generally enabling constraints. What we mean by that is you can go as fast or slow as you want in a roundabout as long as you go the right direction and as long as you yield to the people in the circle. Traffic lights have governing constraints, which means it doesn't matter what the context is. You have to stop when the light is red. There is no room for judgment or agency in that. One is based on command and control, or control and compliance. That's our old school operating system. And one is based on the idea of trust and autonomy. But the question is, which is better? Which is safer? People have a lot of assumptions that traditional bureaucracies will keep us safe. But in fact, roundabout operating systems tend to produce more, to be faster, to be cheaper, and to be safer. And I'm using this as an example to just have an easy mind frame, but the same thing is true in your company or in your team as it is on the road. People who are able to self-manage tend to produce more, be happier, and in general, make work a better experience for themselves and those around them than the people who are in systems where they have to wait to be told. This is how we visualize the operating system. And I think when we get to talk a little bit, it could be interesting to hear some of the places that you see challenges here. When we talk about the operating system, what I am trying to help companies do is think about both their principles and their practices. So a principle is something like autonomy, but what is a practice around autonomy? You know, I often hear from people, I have really smart people and I want them to be empowered and I want them to make decisions and I don't want them to have to ask me for permission for everything. And then I say, okay, that sounds to me like it's about authority. What are your practices around authority? And often we don't really have any. And so this is where I'm looking at a different kind of decision-making process, really clear decision rights for people, a bar of safe to try rather than optimized or perfect, a more experimental mindset in terms of how we make moves and how we make change. That's just one example from the authority field. There are many examples in all of the fields of the OS that we can use. The point that I'm making is just, we want to be designing for something more like a roundabout than more like a traffic light. So when we design a new meeting format, if it looks like the boss sets the time, the boss dictates the agenda items, the boss does 80% of the talking, and at the end, the boss says, any questions, and we all shake our heads and then leave the room, that feels a lot like a traffic light version of a meeting to me. What we're looking for is, what is the roundabout version of the meeting? What's the version of the meeting where we can all bring our own items to get what we need? What's the part of the meeting where we actually talk in a round so that all of the voices are heard? What's our agreement around disagreeing and how we do that in a way that leads us to better ideas? These are practices in our operating system that will help us have a different kind of OS. And they might sound like small moves, but when they add up over time and over humans and over repetition, you start to really shift from an old way of working to a way of working that is more people positive and more complexity conscious. And when we talk about those two ideas, here's what we mean. A lot of people have assumptions about people positivity, that it's about niceness or it's about kindness. What we mean by people positive is, fundamentally, people want to have an impact. They want meaning from their work if they're going to show up and do it every day, and that people have an ability to change. There's a lot of assumption in old school thinking that is, people can't adapt, people are stuck. And we just don't believe that that's true, and research does not bear that out. So our people positive lens is, we can try new ways of working and people will be able to adapt to them. And if they give people more voice, more ability to contribute, more authority, that will work well. People will take that authority and do good stuff with it. And on the other side, we're looking for solutions in our OS that are complexity conscious. And what we mean by that is, what are the simple rules that keep us safe, rather than having complicated rules with 15 approvals and 25 ways to check the box and an exhaustive inventory of the thing that's out of date in 20 minutes. We are looking for the simplest possible solution that we can test and learn and iterate as we go. And a lot of times when I go into a company for the first time, because they're in a complicated mindset, they're like, we want to do a huge reorg. We want to redraw all the boxes and we need all different kinds of roles. And we're going to train people to think differently and do things differently. And I'm like, time out. That's not people positive or complexity conscious. What we want to be doing instead is trying new practices with an experimental mindset and learning as we go. And we see companies do this really well. And I'm just going to give one example here because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to chat with each other. We often point to Morningstar Farms as being, Morningstar as being a really good example of this. It's a very large tomato processing company. And Morningstar has been largely self-managing since its inception in the 70s. And they have practices in a lot of different areas of their operating system that are quite unique and quite interesting. So one that we love to talk about is their compensation practice. Morningstar has self-set pay, which means that everyone from a tomato picker up to the CEO decides what they're going to pay themselves for their role each year. They have to publish that transparently with an explanation of what they intend to contribute for that money. And if someone around them disagrees or has a conflict or doesn't feel that they do contribute at that level, they have a very robust resolution process to go through to get to an end state. Now, I know for a fact that that has happened in Morningstar's history, not very often, but a complicated mindset, like the bank teller mindset, would be if something bad happened once, we would shut the whole program down, put people back on the salaries we tell them to have, and go on with their day. A more complexity conscious mindset is, okay, if we have a disagreement, we need a different kind of constraint to deal with that disagreement. And we continue to test and build based on what we need, not based on trying to predict the future. We ground the work that we do in the present, and we solve for a tension that has already happened in our operating system, rather than spending a lot of time trying to plan. And that is how we want to change systems so that we can ultimately change the world. That's a little bit about us and the Ready. I would be delighted to answer your questions about anything you heard, anything you're seeing going on in your own system, or anything else that's interesting to y'all.
Rodney, thank you a lot. Always good, not only the content, the energy, but the provocation. And I go straight to try to transfer your view to this learning field that we are talking about on this event. Because somehow the traditional training, it's very good about complexity conscious and people positive, because either you believe that people will go there and learn or not. I can't decide for you what you're going to learn, when you're going to learn. So based on your experience in companies, what do you feel the influence of the general culture on the learning culture and the other way around? So how learning plays a role in the OS of the company?
It's a great question. So it plays a huge role. It plays the biggest role, I would say, because if we're going to take an experimental mindset on how we work, if we're not going to assume that the way it's always been done or the way that we've always done it is the right way, if it's not working for us, then we have to be in learning. And what that looks like is us having a new experience, doing our compensation a different way, doing a meeting a different way, doing a decision-making process a different way, but then also reflecting, sense-making, understanding patterns, and really learning. So I think that the biggest key to successful self-managing organizations is a learning orientation. And it's really tricky because in our traditional systems, we're rewarded for knowing, not for learning. And a lot of us have had a lot of success by being the expert in the room or being able to know the answer in class, or being, smarter or better prepared than someone else. And in complexity, we really want to ground into, we can't have this all figured out because we don't know the future. And so we are going to learn our way into it together. So I think it's very critical. What I see happen that to me feels like the stoplight version of learning, not the roundabout version of learning, is we'll take them out of the context, we'll teach them over here, and then we'll put them in the roundabout and expect them to drive well. That's not a good way to learn. Nobody learns how to drive in a classroom. So what I would like to see more companies and more people with a learning focus doing is, how are we getting people into the driver's seat, and how are we coaching them so that they can really take advantage of those simple constraints, so that they can use the agency they have, and so ultimately they can go faster while keeping themselves and others safe. But I worry when I see the stoplight solution to training, which is do it over there, not in the work that we have to do.
Very good.
Very good. And you spoke a lot about self-management, which we believe it's great, but we still live in a country where most of the companies have leaders that understand that their role it is to know all or to manage hours and tasks. So what is your advice here on how to enable that? It is change the leaders. It is to what to focus on their development so they can embrace also the self-management.
It's a great question. So the first thing to say is that self-management doesn't have to mean leaderless. It just means that we think about leadership not as one monolithic role that holds all the power and makes all the decisions and tells everybody what to do, but that it is many roles potentially held by one person or held by many people. We often joke that the CEO is a really silly title because the CEO job is about 17 jobs. And so in self-management, what really to me, so that it's not too scary to leaders, we don't want to start with get rid of all the bosses, just throw them all away. What we want to get to is, what is the purpose of leadership and what do we need from it as a system? What would a leader that really serves the aim of our team or organization look like and do? A lot of times for leaders who have a more traditional mindset, they are very interested in that work because they also don't enjoy checking the 100 bank teller forms a day. They also have a sense that they're wasting their own time. And they also want some agency so that they can design their role so that they're having the maximum amount of impact, so that they're also experiencing meaning in their work. So a lot of times we can't just rip all the pipes out of the wall and rebuild the house. But an easy way to start is by considering, okay, what are the roles in this team that we need to get this work done? Which of those should be held by the leader? There probably are some. They're probably around securing budget, advocating to the higher level, getting hiring authority. There's probably a lot of stuff that we need, especially in a traditional system for our leader. But rather than just saying, this person is the boss, so they're the stoplight, let's just get clear on what's the most valuable thing they can do in service of our work. And often that as a shift for traditional leaders is one that they can make pretty quickly.
Very good.
Very good. Regarding learning culture, I'd like to hear some experiments or some interventions that you saw in your life, either as consultant or as when you were executive, that you think is good for the healthy learning culture.
Great question. So the easiest practice that I really encourage any team to adopt truly starting tomorrow is retrospectives. Probably lots of people in your audience know about retros or a version of the retro, but we are so oriented in a traditional system, in a traditional OS, to predicting the future and trying to plan. And we spend all our time planning and trying to think about what's going to happen and what should happen and if it didn't happen, whose fault it was that it didn't happen, and what we're going to do instead. And we spend very little time reflecting on what has happened already and making sense of that. So a retrospective, if your team doesn't have a 1 hour retrospective on the calendar at least once every 6 weeks to just go like, hey, what went well? What didn't go so well? What did we learn? Let's start doing that, because that will probably be the most important hour of your month over time. And that is a learning practice that's done in a group. It's done in a way that's participatory. It's done in a way that's not about blame. It's not about an individual. It's just about learning from our experience and hopefully learning about the system that we're in, because that's what planning doesn't often account for. Our plan might be beautiful on a piece of paper, but it usually doesn't think about whether the broader environment is going to cooperate with us. When we're looking back, though, we can say, okay, this delay in shipment was a real problem, but we didn't know that the supply chain was going to break in the way that it did. So, okay, what do we need to learn from that? And how do we need to use that learning? So there are great tools out there. You can use Parable, you can use Miro or Mural. There's tons of templates that you can avail yourself of. If you happen to be in a room with people, good old fashioned sticky notes with a few prompts, but get the group to generate so that you can see convergence, divergence, and patterns, because that's a lot of what learning is.
Very good. Simple, practical, one meeting every other 6 weeks at least. Great.
Love it. Great resignation. It is a hot topic, so we want to hear your view, your opinion on, and know from you what is the negative and the positive impact on our world of work today.
It's such a great question. And to be honest, I remember about 6 months ago saying in a meeting about our podcast, we should do something on the Great Resignation. Like, this is happening. I'm reading about it everywhere. We should do an episode on this. And then very quickly, I was like, I don't actually know what's going on here. So I say that because to me, the Great Resignation is a perfect encapsulation of what complexity really means and why we have to be complexity conscious. The Great Resignation isn't just about unionization. It isn't just about Black Lives Matter. It isn't just about the pandemic. It isn't just about women having an outsized amount of household responsibilities. It isn't just about the wealth gap. It isn't just about remote work. It's about all of those things combining in a soup that now tastes like the Great Resignation. And I say that because you can't plan your way out of that. And that's what I see companies trying to do. They're seeing this weather pattern emerge from all of these factors and many others that I didn't even list and I don't even understand. And what they're saying is, okay, we need a new benefits plan. We need a new hybrid work plan. We need to raise our rates to this, and we need to train people in this way, and we need to hire these people. And I'm like, spoiler alert, it's not going to work, because you're trying to plan your way out of something that you can't. And to me, the thing that I would really encourage any company to be doing, any team to be doing, is look at that operating system. What about your OS is attracting people, and what about it is making it really easy for them to go? Maybe there's some stuff in there around compensation. There often is, but I think that people talking about comp as the primary is an oversimplification, and I don't think that that's it. In the best companies that I work with and in our own company, we have not seen this to be a huge problem, because they have the kind of OS where people can do the best work of their lives. And what we're finding is that more and more people, especially generations younger than mine, want meaning, and they're not willing to stick around and just be told what to do and not exercise creativity and not have their ideas heard and not have any control over their own work, their own lives, their own schedules. And that's just OS work. That's just, that's doing what you can internally rather than trying to control an external environment. So I'm sure there are a lot of downsides that companies are experiencing, and I certainly hear that from clients in terms of the challenges of hiring people. And to me, this is a moment that has catalyzed hundreds of thousands of people to take a hard look at whether our systems are working. And just because of the sheer scale of it, the people who have the ability to change those systems are listening. And so I get really excited when I see a movement like that, that is a pro-worker, pro-good work, pro-good system kind of movement getting traction, because there's been a drumbeat around a lot of what's happening right now for decades, but it's been pretty easy to ignore in a lot of ways. And now it doesn't feel like it is. And so that to me is very compelling. And also I have empathy for people who are struggling to have enough team members to get their work done.
Rodney, thank you a lot. It was the best way for us to finish this 2 amazing days that we have together. Thank you a lot for taking your time and spend all your knowledge with us. Hopefully we're going to see you again, and you're going to put the podcast on the chat because people are asking for. So please keep doing it.
Okay, we definitely will. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.